Well, hey there, you're on the internet. I had surgery on the back of my head 2 days ago, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is by Diamine, and I have in sample form, and it's actually one of those kind of notorious inks for being terribly, terribly misnamed. It's Diamine Dark Brown, which, as you can probably tell from this little swab at the top, is not even remotely dark. So yeah, that's why I bought it, because I thought it would make for an amusing review. Mostly it just kind of annoyed me. But yeah, so there you go. The two pens that I used were this Retro 51 Tornado, and it has a European fine nib, but it's also possibly one of the driest pens that I own. So in that regard, it's very, very sort of gentle and moderate. And then this Knox Plato with a medium nib, which is also a very, very wet nib. My cat is very angry. Then I compare it to some other browns or just interesting inks. Here's Diamine's dark brown up at the top, which you can see is not dark brown even remotely. Here's Noodler's Beaver, Noodler's V-Mail Burma Road Brown, Noodler's Brown, Mont Blanc Toffee Brown, Noodler's 41 Brown, Schaefer Script Brown, Roi und Klinger Sepia, and Gerabon's Ombre de Burmanie, which is mostly just kind of yellow, but yeah. Let's check out the chromatography. Now here's how you're supposed to do chromatography. Put a little bit of ink at the bottom, instantly dunk it in water. As you can see, something remains, but there's not a lot of ink in that ink. Yeah, and then here I let it dry, where it's pretty much the same. So, yeah, interesting. Paper test, top down in density, Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Hold this really still so you can see just how thin this ink is. Yeah, so it's certainly not dark brown, and it's one of the wateriest inks I think I've encountered in a long time. I'm going to try and show you the bit I wrote with the Tornado. See just how thin that is. Yeah, I mean, you can see, even in the darkest parts, you can see the tiny lines from the Sayas paper. And also, it had very long dry times, which I can't explain because there's not a lot of ink in this ink. So the very dry fine took 8 seconds to dry, and the pretty wet medium took 24. Now, it's well behaved in that there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, and there's no sheen. But honestly, with how dense this paper is and how thin and light this ink is, I wouldn't expect any echo. And it's... So one of the things with watery inks is you get a very distinct degree of shading. You know, there's a very wide spectrum. However, in this regard, it really only highlights how thin the ink is. So it's not a very complementary kind of shading. You know, it highlights how undersaturated the ink is. It's not a pleasant look. And also, there's not a lot of water resistance. This made a mess. In fact, the camera is actually showing the writing to be darker than it is in real life with the plain eye. So, yeah, made a mess. It washed off a lot of it. Not great. Next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter, where the dry times are almost the same. The very dry fine took 8 seconds. The fairly wet medium took 23. Again, there's a very broad spectrum of shading, but it's not complementary. I mean, even here you can see the dots from the dot pad through the writing at the darkest parts. It's not complementary. There's, again, well behaved in the regard that there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Excuse me. Sorry. I had a dry throat, and then being intubated, it just got really, really worse. Anyways, yeah, also, I don't find the color pleasant. It looks like a cardboard box. It's not a nice brown. And the flow is just 5 out of 10, you know, it's where you don't have to fight it, and you don't have to try and stem it. So it's not great, and it made a mess. A lot of it washed away. In fact, the fine is completely gone, and it just made a mess. See, all the downstrokes were with the wet medium, and those dots that remain were made with the wet medium. So, Next is Tomoe River, And one of the things Tomoe River Paper is known for doing is really accentuating shading. But in this regard, it just showed just how thin this ink can get. And it also is known for drawing out dry times, but since these dry times are already kind of long, here they just got epic. The very dry fine took 17 seconds to dry. That's quite long. And the wet medium took more than a minute. And a lot of the dots just never seemed to dry, which was infuriating. Now you do get a very wide degree of shading, because I mean, look how dark it gets there, and then how thin it can get there. But it just highlights how undersaturated this ink is. There isn't enough ink in this ink. So, yeah, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, as you would expect with Tomoe River Paper. It doesn't, you know, it's very rare that you see those things. However, it's very thin, and so I guess it depends on just how sensitive you are to it, but the very, very heavily laid on parts, you might get a bit of echo, but yeah, and Tomoe River loves to let ink slide away when you add more water, which is certainly what happened here. That is utterly gone. In fact, the camera's picking up more of that than the naked eye can. Next is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper, where I only use that very dry fine, except to write the name up here. And this absorbent paper tends to rob ink of its vibrancy, and somehow, even though it was never terribly vibrant in the first place, it still managed to do that, kind of. It still retained shading, sort of, but again, it only highlighted the problem areas. So that's where you sort of see the most spread and feather. So 3 seconds to dry, which I can't explain because this paper is so absorbent, usually just sucks the ink in. But yeah, it doesn't bleed much except for the dots. The camera, or the light I have is quite powerful, so it's not making this easy on me, but yeah, so the dots nearly come through. But yeah, it's the spread is obscene. If you look at the width of the line from here compared to here, I mean, this looks like a generous medium now, and this is, you know, the Tornado is one of the finest, driest nibs I own, so not a great showing. There's feathering throughout. It looks very watery. Now, absorbent paper tends to suck the ink in, which makes it hard to wash out, but here it still managed to wash a lot of it out. It still managed to make a mess. It feathered and exploded. Not great. Next is Mead Notebook Paper, where again I only use the fine except to write the name. And here too, it managed to look thin and watery, which is rather sad. And again, this is fairly absorbent paper, so the fact that it took 3.5 seconds to dry, I really can't explain. Now, here it wasn't awful. There are spots of near bleed through, as I say, and it's all throughout. But yeah, it's as you can see, or maybe you can't because of the light. Okay, so that's with the wet medium, but there's significant echo. But actually, there's not. So you might be able to tell. I'm going to bring this in close. There's not feathering so much, just a bit of a woolliness. So in that regard, it's very nice. It did fairly well here. I can't promise anything beyond a very, very dry fine nib that'll perform like this. The water test was awful. A lot of it washed out. It did dye the page. It did sort of feather and explode a little. Something to be careful of. Lastly, Moleskine Notebook Paper, where again I only use the dry fine except to write the name. Here it did retain some shading, but again it's not the complementary kind. It just shows how undersaturated it is. And again, I can't explain the very long dry times considering how absorbent this paper is. It took 7 seconds to dry. I have no answers. But yeah, as I say, finally something almost positive to say. There are not as many feathers as expected, which is true. You don't see a ton of feathers, you just see a couple. They're not to the point of being distracting, you know, where it's all over and everything looks like a cactus. There's near bleed through in spots. I don't know if I'll be able to get this on camera, but yeah, you see a little bit of it here and there, but it's not as bad as what we usually see on Moleskine, so there's that. There is some spread. It's not as bad as the copier paper, but there is some. And this paper really hates water, and so it completely feathered and exploded and dried the page, but that's irrecoverable. That's just gone. So yeah, so there you go. There's Diamine's dark brown. It's not a dark brown at all. It looks like a cardboard box that had been left out in the sun. It has very long dry times. It's not great on cheap paper. It's just kind of okay. Keep it in a dry, fine pen. Yep. For your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.